Belding stood alone in his dark room at the ranch house in Forlorn River. The air was still, and the suffocating heat of midsummer hung heavily upon the house. He picked up his gun belt from the table and slowly fastened it around his waist. The weight of the gun against his hip felt familiar, comforting, and inspiring. He paused at the door as if he was about to leave, but then changed his mind and started pacing back and forth across the room. He finally stopped at the table and reluctantly unbuckled his gun belt, laying it down. Belding knew this action wasn't final. He'd witnessed the violent border life of Texas during its early days and had been a sheriff in a time when the law in the West relied on the quickness of one's wrist. He'd seen many a man give up their gun for good and all. But Belding's own actions weren't final. He'd done the same thing countless times before, but this last time it felt a little harder, a little more indicative of vacillation. Belding and Mona had returned from a ride in the desert. They were both pale and trembling and refused to speak of what had happened. Since that day they had both been different. Mrs. Belding had lost her cheerful manner, and Mona had become quiet and withdrawn. Belding had tried to get them to talk, but they would not. He had his suspicions, but he did not know what to do. He had never felt so helpless before. His gun had become his sole companion. He would sit for hours, cleaning and oiling it, or he would take it out and shoot at targets. He had become an expert marksman. The gun gave him a sense of power and control that he had lost in his life. The chases could take away his land and his job, but they could not take away his gun. It was his last defense against a world that seemed to be closing in on him. Belding recognized his old schoolmate, the elder Chase, as a former suitor who had been rejected. It took some time for Belding to realize that something was amiss in his household. The fact that the Gales were present made it hard for Mrs. Belding and Mona to express their true feelings. Nevertheless, Belding eventually became aware that there was a secret cause of grief other than Gorman's loss. He knew this when his wife revealed her desire to visit her hometown in Peoria. She didn't provide many reasons, but she did show him a letter from old friends. The letter contained news that may or may not have been true. An old prospector had returned to Peoria and had claimed to have met Robert Edwards at the Sonoyta Oasis 15 years prior. Edwards had supposedly gone into the desert and never returned. Belding had heard rumors of Edwards's death before, so this news wasn't surprising. The strange thing was that both Mona's father and grandfather had also been lost in the Sonora Desert. Belding didn't object to his wife's desire to visit her hometown. He thought it would be good for her and tried to persuade Mona to go with her. However, Mona refused to go. After Mrs. Belding left, Belding discovered that Mona was in a state of mind that shocked and saddened him. She had become incredibly unhappy, and even the Gales noticed. Mona refused to tell him anything. After some time, Belding noticed a change in Mona's behavior. He traced it back to a day when he saw her with Radford Chase. Belding despised the persistent suitor, but Mona became increasingly anxious and begged Belding not to hurt him. This behavior was strange to Belding, who had never interfered with his women's affairs before. He was surprised to see that Mona was no longer hiding her relationship with Chase, although she had shown disdain for him before. Belding believed that the Chases had some kind of hold over Mona, which infuriated him. As the summer passed, a terrible storm hit Altar Valley, bringing much-needed rain. Belding was happy to see the Forlorn River running again, but he couldn't help but feel regretful about the full and overflowing Chase Reservoir. The sound of the spillway was the first time he had ever been bothered by the sound of falling water. Workmen were once again out in the fields surrounding Belding's land. The Chases had extended a main irrigation ditch down to Belding's farm, skipped his land, and then continued on through Altar Valley. They had tried every trick in the book to obtain the right to connect the ditches by digging through Belding's land, but he had remained stubborn. Belding refused to have anything to do with them. He couldn't help but be curious and suspicious when he saw a group of Mexicans working on the ditches once more. The next morning, Belding was jolted out of bed by an enormous blast that shook the adobe walls of his house, broke windows, and sent pans and crockery crashing to the floor. Belding assumed that the Chase's store of dynamite had blown up while they were blasting. He quickly got dressed and went to Mona's room to reassure her before heading outside to investigate. The villagers were all shaken up. Many of the poorly constructed adobe huts had crumbled into dust. A thick yellow cloud of smoke hung over the river near the upper end of Belding's plot and close to the river. When Belding reached his fence, the smoke and dust were so thick that he could hardly breathe. At first he couldn't see what had happened, but then he spotted a massive hole in the sand, right around where the irrigation ditch had stopped near his land. The Mexicans had set off an incredibly heavy blast at that point, although Belding couldn't figure out why. He didn't believe that it was an accidental discharge of dynamite. Something else was going on, and Belding was determined to find out what. The soft, sandy earth had given way easily to the shovel, devoid of any rocks that would have caused more harm than good in the construction of a ditch. Belding's feet dragged slowly as he made his way towards a lush green depression where a cluster of willow trees surrounded a beloved never-ending spring that his horses cherished just as much as he did. Though he loved the spring, he hesitated to part the drooping willow branches to enter the cool, shaded path leading to the water source. Suddenly, consumed by anxiety, he sprinted the rest of the way. Arriving just in time, he witnessed the last of the water disappearing as if being swallowed by quicksand. The hole's shape had changed, and the underground stream had been obstructed or diverted by the tremendous force of the blast in the adjacent field. Belding's dependable spring had been destroyed, leaving the once green, sweet, and fragrant land barren. Belding's heart ached with pity for the never-blooming ajo lilies and the withering willows. He recalled the countless nights he had come to the spring to drink in the middle of hot summer days, knowing he would never experience it again. Then the thought of Blanco Diablo, the great white thoroughbred, hit him. The horse had loved this spring, and Belding stood tall, tears clouding his eyes as he looked out over the desert westward. He had never gone a day without thinking about the beautiful animal, but this moment heightened his emotions, and he felt a dull ache in his chest. "Diablo will never drink here again," muttered Belding. The loss of Blanco Diablo had been acknowledged and mourned by Belding, but it never felt entirely genuine until now. As a pall of dust drifted over him and the sound of falling water echoed up at the dam, Belding's attention shifted to the chases. Suddenly, Belding was struck with a frigid realization. The explosion that had shattered the peacefulness of the desert was no accident. It had been orchestrated to destroy the stream that brought life to the area. He couldn't fathom who would be so heinous as to commit such a heinous act. No cowboy, no Indian or Mexican, no inhabitant of the desert would stoop so low as to ruin a pristine, crystal-clear stream of water that was vital for survival. In that moment, Belding's earlier worries, hesitations, and contemplations vanished. He strode back to the house with newfound determination, and his head, which had been bowed down with sadness, was now held high. He went straight to his room, buckled on his gun belt, and examined his firearm. He stood tall and regained his sense of individuality. "Let's think," he murmured. "I can ask Carter to send my horses back to Waco for my brother. Mona can take the remaining money and go search for her mother. The Gales are ready to leave today, and Mona can travel with them part of the way east. That's my plan, Tom Belding, don't you forget it." As he left his room, he encountered Mr. Gorman, who had been staying at Forlorn River. Despite the harrowing events that had unfolded, the long stay in the desert had done wonders for Mr. Gorman's health. The arid climate, the warmth, and the tranquility had all contributed to his improved state. "Belding, what was that deafening noise?" Mr. Gorman inquired with concern. "We were all terribly frightened until Miss Mona came to our aid." "We thought it was an earthquake," said Belding as he recounted the explosion that had just occurred on his property to Mr. Gorman. "I've had my fair share of quakes here, but this was something else entirely." Mr. Gorman was outraged by the incident and expressed his disbelief at Belding's nonchalant attitude towards the matter. Belding tried to explain that he had been preoccupied with his family issues, namely his mother and Mona, but Mr. Gorman was not convinced. Belding eventually revealed that he was planning to send Mona away to her mother's and hoped that Mr. Gorman could take her part of the way. Mr. Gorman agreed to take her all the way to his home and even offered to have her stay for a visit. Belding was relieved at the offer and hoped that Mr. Gorman would leave soon. He had been delaying his departure due to the hope that Richard, who was lost, would return. However, now that they were sure of his fate, Mr. Gorman saw no reason to stay any longer. Belding gruffly understood his decision and thanked him for his hospitality. "Let's go tell the ladies to start packing," said Belding, interrupting Mona's breakfast preparations. He took her into the sitting room while Mr. Gorman called his wife and daughter. "I have some news for you, my girl," began Belding. "Mr. Gorman and his family are leaving today. I'm sending you with them part of the way, and you're invited to visit them. It'll be great for you to get away and forget. But the main thing is that you're going east to join your mother." Mona stared at him, pale and silent. "You see, Mona, I'm about done with Forlorn River," continued Belding. "The blast this morning destroyed my spring. There's no water now. It was the last straw. So we're leaving Forlorn River. I'll come on a little later, that's all." "Dad, you're taking your gun," exclaimed Mona, pointing with a trembling finger. She ran to him, but he pushed her away, his movements no longer slow and gentle. "Why, so I am," he replied coolly, reaching for the sheath at his hip. "Mona, I'm that absent-minded these days." "Dad!" she cried, but he silenced her with a voice she'd never heard before. "Get breakfast now, then pack to leave Forlorn River." "Leave Forlorn River?" whispered Mona, her hand trembling over her heart. How much she had changed. Belding regretted his harshness, but said nothing. Mona was fading away, just like Selina had before Thorne's arrival. Mona turned to the west window and looked out at the desert, towards the dim blue peaks in the distance. Belding watched her, as did the gales, and no one spoke. A long silence followed, and Belding felt a lump rise in his throat. Mona rested her arm against the window frame, but soon let it drop and leaned her face against the wood. A low sob escaped her. Elsie Gorman approached her, wrapping her in a warm embrace and resting her head on her shoulder. "We've become such good friends," she said. "I think it'd do you good to visit me in the city. Staring out at this lonely desert all day can't be good for you. Come with me, Mona." Heavy footsteps echoed outside on the flagstones, followed by a strong knock on the door. Belding opened it to find the Chases, father and son, standing on the threshold. "Good morning, Belding," the elder Chase greeted him. "We were woken up early by that loud blast and came to see what was wrong. Turns out it was all a mistake. The foreman was drunk yesterday and his workers made an error. Sorry if the noise caused you any trouble." "Chase, I believe that's the first blast of yours that I'm happy to hear," Belding replied, causing Chase to look puzzled. "Really? Well, I'm glad you're glad," he responded, still confused. "I was worried that maybe you'd be upset. We've never been able to see eye to eye. I rushed over here thinking you might be angry about the blast, you see, Belding." "I see this, Mr. Ben Chase," Belding interrupted him with a firm and cutting voice. "That blast was a mistake, the biggest one you've ever made in your life." "What do you mean?" Chase demanded. "If you'll excuse me for a moment, we're in the middle of something here. Mr. Gorman and his family are leaving, and my daughter is going with them. I'd appreciate it if you could wait a little while longer," Belding said. "Mona's leaving?" Radford Chase exclaimed, sounding like a disappointed child. "Yes, but it's Miss Edwards to you, young man," Belding corrected him. "Mr. Chase, I'd rather we spoke later. There are other important matters that need to be addressed." "Excuse us, sir, but we need to settle this matter," said the elder Chase as they approached Belding's house. Belding, not one to mince words, replied, "I'm particular about who I invite into my house, but I'll go with you." As they stepped out of the house, Belding requested they move away from the women so as not to cause a scene. The younger Chase seemed completely oblivious to the situation at hand, while the elder was visibly angry but managing to control it. However, as soon as they were out of earshot, Ben Chase began to berate Belding, accusing him of insulting him and his son. Belding, not one to be spoken to in such a manner, interrupted him with a colorful expletive. This caused Chase to turn livid, but he managed to regain his composure and began speaking in a more reasonable tone. Chase attempted to explain his side of the story, insisting that business is business and that the law had upheld his actions. Belding, curious to hear more, listened intently, despite believing that nothing could change his mind about the matter. Overall, Belding was left with a better understanding of Chase's character, even if he ultimately remained unconvinced. Regarding mining and water claims, you lost on a technicality. The law requires proof that you held them for 5 years, which you failed to provide. Anyone could claim the source of Forlorn River, but without proof of squatters' rights, anybody could contest their ownership of the water. Now I propose running the main ditch through your farm along the river. Can we strike a deal? I am willing to be more than fair and give you a stake in the company. I believe I have enough influence to have you reinstated as inspector. If you show some reasonableness, you can return to Forlorn River with the possibility of becoming wealthy. There's a bright future here. My vested interest, Belding, has become personal. Radford is in love with your stepdaughter and wishes to marry her. If I had foreseen this, I wouldn't have been so pushy. However, we can resolve this issue. Let's work together, not just in business, but as a family. If my son's happiness depends on having this girl, I will do everything in my power to make it happen. I will even reimburse you for your losses. What do you say?" "No," replied Belding. "Your money cannot buy a right-of-way across my ranch. And Mona does not want your son. That's that." "But you could persuade her." "I won't, that's all." "May I ask why?" Chase's voice was losing its smoothness, but it was still quick. "Sure, I don't mind you asking," replied Belding slowly. "I wouldn't stoop so low. Plus, if I were to do it, I'd want it to be for a man." Radford Chase was fuming with anger, shouting incoherently, but Belding paid him no heed, his eyes fixed on the long path leading to the river. The elder Chase attempted to calm his son down, fiddling with his shirt collar and claiming that his son's marriage proposal was a great honor. But Belding remained silent, his composure unwavering. Chase then took a new approach, attacking Mona's right to the Edwards name. Belding, still cool and collected, admitted he had no knowledge of this. Chase continued, claiming to have grown up with Mona Simon in Peoria, where she was known for her beauty and popularity. He also claimed that Bob Edwards, who was engaged to Mona, left town before the truth about her came out. Mona then ran away, and Edwards disappeared for years until word came that Mona was in Oklahoma and Edwards was in Denver. Chase ended his story by suggesting that it was unlikely that Edwards had followed Mona and married her, thus making her a legitimate Edwards. Belding didn't react to Chase's story, instead asking if he had any proof. It struck him as odd that Chase knew so little about the West and its people. Chase claimed that he had enough evidence to convince any reasonable man of the truth, but Belding remained skeptical. Belding's past and the reason for her secrecy. He felt a surge of sympathy for her and anger towards Chase for using this information as leverage. Belding took a step towards Chase, his eyes hardening. "You are a despicable man, Chase," he spat. "I will not allow my stepdaughter to marry into a family with such a lack of honor and decency." With that, he turned on his heel and strode back towards the house, leaving Chase and his son standing in stunned silence. Mona had no idea what had just transpired, but she could sense the tension in the air as Belding entered the house. She looked up at him expectantly, but he merely muttered something about needing to check on the horses before disappearing into the barn. Mona sighed and leaned back against the porch railing, wondering when her life would ever be free of secrets and lies. Belding was in anguish, the cause of Mona's departure. He finally understood what had been tormenting her, and it felt as though all the worst emotions were surging within him. He acted out blindly, hitting Ben Chase so hard that he stumbled back into the fence corner. Then he reached out and yanked Radford Chase back to stand beside his father. "I get it now," Belding spoke hoarsely. "You saw the woman's vulnerability, her love for the girl, and you saw the girl's flaw, her pride and fear of shame. So you drove one and tormented the other. How despicable! To tell the girl was bad enough, but to threaten her with exposure? There are no words for that." Belding's voice choked up and he stopped speaking, breathing heavily. He took a few steps back, which would have been alarming from any other armed man, but instead of frightening the Chases, it seemed to reassure them. If Belding had any compassion, he would have felt it then. "And now, gentlemen," Belding continued, speaking low and with difficulty, "since I have rejected your offer, I assume you think you have no reason to keep quiet." The older Chase man appeared to be transfixed by something he saw or felt in Belding, and his ash-colored face grew paler. He lifted a trembling hand. Then Radford Chase, livid and snarling, burst out, "I'll talk until I'm blue in the face. You can't stop me." "You'll turn blue in the face, but it won't be from talking," Belding hissed. He swung his large arm down, and when he brought it back up, the gun glinted in his hand. At the same time, a sharp, piercing whistle split the air. The sound of the horse's whistle was familiar, and it drained all the strength from Belding's body. As he stood there, he suddenly heard the sound of rapid hooves and a piercing whistle. In a husky voice, he cried out, "Blanco Diablo!" He turned to see a massive white horse come thundering into the yard, wild and gaunt. It was none other than the beloved Blanco Diablo, and he was being ridden by a bronzed, long-haired Indian. More white horses galloped into the yard, whistling as they came to a stop. Amidst the commotion, he caught sight of a slim shadow of a girl with big black eyes. Suddenly, Blanco's soul appeared from under the trees, dazzling white and as beautiful as ever. He slid to a halt and then began to stamp and plunge. His rider leaped off, throwing the bridle aside. As he watched, a powerful, spare, ragged man emerged from the chaos with dark, gaunt features and eyes that seemed to burn like fire. Just then, Mona came running from the house, her golden hair flying behind her. Her hands were outstretched and her face was filled with wonder. "John! John! Oh, John!" she cried out. Her voice sent shivers down his spine and his eyes began to blur. He wasn't sure if he was seeing things clearly or not. As he looked around, a long, thin, shrunken face came into view, haggard and tragic in its semblance of torture, almost as if it were on the brink of death. But the eyes were sharp and kind, and he knew that he wasn't dreaming. "I sure am glad to see you all," said a well-remembered voice in a slow, cool drawl. Chapter 21. Lad, Lashthorn, and Selina were all wrapped tightly in Belding's embrace. He then took off running towards Blanco Diablo. To Belding's surprise, the magnificent horse was calm and content. Blanco Diablo remembered his beloved owner and nuzzled him with affection. John Gorman was hunched over Mona's small body, holding her close. Belding hugged them both, feeling a rush of childlike joy. He noticed Ben Chase and his son slipping away into the trees, but he paid them no mind. "John! John!" he bellowed. "Is it really you?" "Hey, who's that over there in Forlorn River?" Gorman grabbed Belding with a hand as rough as sandpaper and as strong as a vice. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were burning with intensity. Suddenly, 3 more people arrived on the scene. Elsie Gorman was running towards them, her father assisting Mrs. Gorman, who seemed about ready to faint. "Belding, who is that?" exclaimed John hoarsely. "I don't know, my son," replied Belding, his voice shaky. "Mona, come here, give him some space." Belding put his arm around Mona and whispered in her ear, "This is going to be great." Elsie's face was pale and agitated, reflecting extreme joy. "Oh, brother, Mama saw you, Papa saw you, and they didn't even recognize you. But I knew it was you when you jumped off your horse like that. And now I don't even know you, you wild man, you giant, you splendid barbarian. Mama, Papa, hurry, it's John, look at him, just look at him, oh, thank God." Belding turned away and led Mona with him. In just a few seconds, she and Selina were embracing each other. It was a time of joyful greetings all around. The Yaqui stood leaning against a tree, watching the welcoming home of the lost. No one seemed to notice him until Belding, ever mindful of the needs of horses, put his hand on Blanco Diablo and called out to Yaqui to bring the others. They led the string of horses down to the barn, freed them of their wet and dusty saddles and packs, and turned them loose in the breast-high alfalfa. Diablo found his old spirit, Blanco Soul tossed his head and whinnied with satisfaction, and White Woman pranced back and forth. Eventually they all settled down to quiet grazing. It was such a sight for Belding to see those white shapes against the rich green background. His eyes glistened. It was a sight he thought he would never see again. He hesitated there for a few moments when he wanted to return to his rangers quickly, but he couldn't take his eyes off Blanco Diablo. Eventually, Belding tore himself away from the sight and went back to the house. To his surprise, Jim and Miller were sleeping soundly on their beds. They had only taken off their boots and chaps while their clothes were in shreds. Jim looked like a tall, dark figure of skin and bones, hard as iron. Miller, on the other hand, appeared like an old man, starved and shriveled. Despite their physical state, Belding admired the strength and nobility in their gaunt faces, especially Miller's, who had endured so much torture. Thorne and Selina were nowhere to be seen, and Belding could hear the soft murmur of voices from Mrs. Gorman's room. Assuming that John was still with his family, he thought that he too would soon seek rest and sleep. Belding walked through the patio and stopped by Mona's door. She sat by her window, her face still flush with happiness, but there was a hint of fear in her eyes. He had wanted to talk to someone, but the expression on Mona's face made him pause. Mona could see what he was thinking, and she dropped her head, losing all color in her face. Belding stood beside her, placing a hand on hers, struggling to find the right words to say. He realized that the more he tried, the more he couldn't speak at all. "Mona, John's back safe and sound," he said slowly. "That's the most important thing. I wish you could have seen the way he looked at you when he held you in his arms out there. Of course, John's return changes our plans, and your trip east won't be happening. We haven't been having the best of times lately, but things are about to change. John is as loyal as they come, and he'll make sure that Chase guy gets what's coming to him. Once Mother gets home, she'll figure out what's going on and straighten everything out. No matter what happens to Mona, I know John Gorman will feel the same way I do. So don't worry, girl." Belding left the patio and walked back towards the corrals, lost in thought. He knew his wife needed him, and if she had been home, he wouldn't have been so close to killing those two men. Mona wouldn't be feeling so down either. Whatever the truth was about his wife's tragedy, it wouldn't make a difference to him. What mattered was that his wife and daughter were in pain, and he needed to put an end to that. He found the Yaqui sleeping in a corner of the barn just as deeply as the Rangers were. Looking down at him, Belding felt a rush of eagerness to learn what had happened since the night Yaqui had led the white horses into the desert. But he knew he needed to be patient and take care of other tasks he had neglected. Suddenly Mr. Gorman appeared, brimming with happiness and excitement. He bombarded Belding with questions, not giving him a chance to answer any of them. Finally, when Mr. Gorman ran out of breath, Belding spoke up. "Listen, Mr. Gorman, you know as much as I do. John's back, and they're all back, but they're in bad shape. Starved, burned, torn to pieces, and worked to the limit. I've never seen anything like it in all my years of traveling the desert. But they're alive and well, man, just wait. I won't sleep or eat until I hear that story." Belding couldn't help but chuckle as he watched the excitement and anxiety in Mr. Gorman's face. However, there was something else that caught his attention, which he assumed was pride. Belding recalled John's confessions about his father's opinion of him, but he had always sided with the boy. Yet over time, Belding had grown fond of Mr. Gorman, appreciating his kindness and wisdom. He believed that college and business had not brought out his best qualities, which the West had done for many young men. Belding decided to have a bit of fun at Mr. Gorman's expense, so he made a few comments that left John's father speechless. "But they've got to sleep and eat," he added with a grin. "Just keep out of earshot when Laddie tells us the story of that desert trip, unless you're hankering to have your hair turn pure white and stand curled on end and freeze that way." The next day, around mid-morning, the Rangers stumbled out of the kitchen and onto the porch. Miller was complaining, "I'm a sick man, I tell you, and I gotta be fed. Soup, beef tea. That ain't so much as wind to me. I want about a barrel of bread and butter, a whole platter of mashed potatoes with gravy and green stuff, all kinds of green stuff, and a whole big apple pie. Give me everything and anything to eat but meat. Sure, I never want to taste meat again, and sight of a piece of sheep meat would just about finish me. Jim, you used to be a human being that stood up for Charlie Miller." "Laddie, I'm lined up beside you with both guns," replied Jim plaintively. "Hungry? Say, the smell of breakfast in that kitchen made my mouth water so I near choked to death." "I swear we're getting the worst treatment," complained Miller. "But I'm sick and I'm about to keel over if someone doesn't give me some food. Mona, you used to be sweet on me." "Oh, Laddie, I still am," replied Mona. "I don't believe you. No girl with a kind heart could let a man starve in front of her. Look at John there. I bet he's had something to eat, maybe potatoes and gravy and pie." "Laddie, John has had no more than I gave you. In fact, not even that much," interrupted Mona. "Well, he must have gotten a lot of kisses then, because he sure hasn't complained about the treatment," retorted Miller. "Maybe he has," said Mona, blushing. "And if you think they would help you be reasonable, I might—" "Well, as much as I adore you, kisses will have to come second to bread and butter right now." "Oh, Laddie, what a charming thing to say," giggled Mona. "I'm sorry, but my dad gave me orders." "Laddie," interjected Belding, "you have to ease into eating. You know that. You'd be a pretty harsh boss if you had starving beggars on your hands." "But I'm sick, I'm dying," wailed Miller. "You've never been sick a day in your life, and if all those bullet holes I see on you couldn't kill you, you never will die," scoffed Belding. "Can I smoke?" asked Miller, suddenly perking up. "My God, I used to smoke. I've forgotten." "Mona, if you want to be back in my good graces, find me a pipe and some tobacco." "I've held on to my pipe," offered Jim, deep in thought. "I think I had it empty in my mouth for about 7 years or so, right, Laddie? It was a long time. I can still see the red lava and the red haze and the red twilight creeping up. It was hot and lonely. The wind howled relentlessly, and an eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by Yaqui's vigilant watch over the west and Laddie's game of checkers. Selina's health deteriorated rapidly, leaving her with nothing but a pair of hollow eyes. Belding abruptly interrupted the conversation, urging Jim to reveal where Yaki had taken him and what had happened to Rickards. Miller volunteered to recount the events, cautioning against exaggeration. Mona brought Miller a pipe, and he settled onto a bench for a lengthy discussion. John attempted to leave, but Mona convinced him to stay. Selina departed, followed by Thorne. Mr. Gorman fetched chairs and excitedly summoned his wife and daughter. Belding leaned forward, his interest piqued by John's reluctance to stay, Selina's distress, and Miller's somber demeanor. Over the course of 2 hours, Miller recounted the story, his voice gradually weakening to a raspy whisper. After he finished, there was a solemn silence. Elsie Gorman rose to her feet, placing her hand on John's shoulder, and expressed her gratitude and admiration for the Rangers and Yaki. Mona clung to John, silently crying. Mrs. Gorman was overwhelmed, and Mr. Gorman, pale and tranquil, assisted her to her room. "The Indian! The Indian!" exclaimed Belding in a booming voice. "Didn't I tell you? Didn't I say that he'd be a godsend? Remember what I said about Yaki and some gory Aztec knife work?" He couldn't believe that Rickards survived being cut loose from the crater wall inch by inch and even managed to avoid the cholla thorns. But Belding's survival was even more impressive, having made it through the long, hot summer in the Camino del Diablo. Belding credited his survival to the Yaki and his trusty horses, Sol and Diablo. The next day, John discovered that Belding's spring had dried up, despite recent rains. Belding revealed that the Chases had used nitroglycerin to sabotage his spring and ruin his ranch. Gorman was shocked by the news and could see the changes that had taken place on the property. Belding told his story, explaining how the Chases had taken advantage of his trust and destroyed everything he had worked for. "Our water's gone, our claims are gone, our plans are stalled. It's unbelievable, Belding. Forlorn River is now full of promoters, businesses, railroads, banks, and whatnot." Suddenly he became fiery and suspicious. "Did these Chases do all this on the level?" "Barefaced robbery, worse than a greaser holdup," replied Belding grimly. "You say the law upheld them?" "Sure. Why, Ben Chase has a pull as strong as Diablo's on a downgrade. John, we've been jobbed, outfigured, beat, tricked, and we can't do a thing." "Oh, I'm sorry, Belding, most of all for Laddie," said Gorman feelingly. "He's all in. He'll never ride again. He wanted to settle down here on the farm he thought he owned, grow grass and raise horses and take it easy. Oh, but it's tough. Say, he doesn't know it yet. He was just telling me he'd like to go out and look the farm over. Who's going to tell him? What's he going to do when he finds out about this deal?" "Son, that's made me think some," replied Belding with keen eyes fast upon the young man. "And I was kind of wondering how you'd take it." "I? Well, I'll call on the Chases. Look here, Belding, I'd better do some forestalling myself. If Laddie gets started now, there'll be blood spilled. He's not just right in his mind yet. He talks in his sleep sometimes about how Yaki finished Rickards. If it's left to him, he'll kill these men. But if I take it up—" "You're talking sense, John. Only here, I'm not so sure of you. And there's more to tell. Son, you've Mona to think of, and your mother." Belding's ranger gave him a long and searching glance. "You can be sure of me," he said. "All right then, listen," began Belding with deep voice that had many a beak and tremor. He told Gorman how Mona had been hounded by Radford Chase, how her mother had been driven by Ben Chase, and the whole sad story. "That's the problem," exclaimed Gorman, his voice breaking. "Poor girl, I knew something was off. Mona wasn't herself. When I asked her to marry me soon while Dad was visiting, she couldn't talk. She just cried." "It was tough on her," said Belding simply. "But it'll be better now that you're back. John, I know Mona. She'll refuse to marry you, and you'll have a hard time convincing her otherwise. It'll be just as hard as the ride you just came off of. I think I know you well enough to say that." "Belding, what are you trying to say?" demanded Gorman. "Are you insinuating that if it were true it would make a difference to me?" "Come on, John, you know I couldn't mean that. I'm just not good with words. And I'm hurt, too." "For God's sake, do you believe Chase's lies?" asked Gorman urgently. "It's not true. I swear it's not true. I know it's not true. I have to tell Mona right now. Come with me, Belding. Why didn't you tell me earlier?" Belding felt Gorman's strong grip as he was pulled towards the sitting room, then out onto the patio, and finally to where Mona was sitting in her doorway. At the sight of them, she let out a small cry, then slumped for a moment before raising a pale face with darkening eyes. "Honey, I know why you're not wearing my mother's ring," said Gorman, his voice steady and low. "John, I don't deserve her." "I'm not worthy," replied Mona, trembling as she held out the ring in her palm. Gorman quickly took her hand, sliding the ring back onto her third finger. "Mona, look at me. This is your engagement ring. Listen, I know that this thing that's been bothering you is a lie. I'm positive your mother will prove it to be a lie." Perhaps she had once suffered from a sad mistake, but he wanted her to know that the thing she feared was not true. He spoke to her with tenderness and reassurance, promising her that he would never think of it again. He would love her even more if she had suffered, and he wanted her to be his wife so he could make her forget. She rose up with the passion of a woman moved to her core, and she kissed him with all her might. "Oh, John, you're so good. You have no idea what those words mean to me. You've saved me, I think." "Then it's all right, dearest?" John asked eagerly. "You'll keep your promise and marry me?" But the light faded from her face, and her blue eyes turned almost black. She shook her head and drooped. "Mona," Gorman exclaimed, catching his breath. "Don't ask me, John. I won't marry you." "Why?" "You know, it's true that I—" "It's a lie," Gorman interrupted fiercely. "But even if it's true, why won't you marry me? Between us, love is the only thing that matters. Don't you love me any more?" They had forgotten about Belding, who stepped back into the shade. "I love you with all my heart and soul. I'd die for you," whispered Mona, clenching her hands together. "But I won't disgrace you. You've been worrying too much about this trouble, Mona. It's grown out of proportion. I'm telling you, I'll be the happiest and luckiest man on earth if you marry me." "John, you haven't considered your family. Would they accept me as your wife?" "They surely would," replied Gorman with determination. "No, oh no." "You're wrong, Mona. I'm happy you said that. It gives me the chance to prove something. I'll go now and tell them all." "I'll be back here in less than a minute," John promised Mona, who was crying with fear and begging him not to tell his mother about her. Mona was afraid that John's mother, who was very proud, would not approve of their relationship and would think less of her if she found out. John, however, knew that he had to fight for their happiness and his own life. He ran off to talk to his family. As Mona waited on the doorstep, Belding, a friend, came to check on her. They waited in silence for what seemed like a long time before John returned. Belding could see the excitement on John's face and knew that something good had happened. John came back glowing and eager, almost smiling. He told Mona that he had told his family about her, but had said that the story was a lie. He wanted his family to decide as if it were true. To his surprise, his mother and everyone else loved Mona. John's mother had even cried over Mona and had come to appreciate the role Mona had played in helping John change for the better. John's mother not only approved of their relationship but wanted Mona to be his wife. Mona was overjoyed and relieved. She realized that she had been wrong to worry and that John's family truly loved her. Mona had backed Andy into a corner, using her motherly influence to force him to make a promise. They were to live in the east half of the year, and that meant they would be spending time in cities like Chicago, Cape May, and New York. Andy was no longer the lost son, and Mona would have to learn who he really was. He reassured her that he still wanted to be a ranger and ride Blanco's soul, and that they would always love the open places the best. Mona was upset, and Andy tried to console her, asking her to forget the trouble and marry him soon. But Mona was crying, her heart broken. She told Andy that she couldn't marry him because of a secret that Radford Chase knew. If Andy ever came back and married her, Chase would follow them all over the world to tell it. Andy grew deathly pale and stood still, asking if Chase had threatened her. Mona poured out her story, telling him how Chase had made her life a nightmare with hints and threats. She didn't dare shut the door in his face, and he laughed at her and her pride. He found out that Andy's mother loved Mona and that Mona loved her, and he began to threaten her. If she didn't give in to him, he'd see that she learned the truth. The words weakened Mona to her core. She couldn't bear the thought of Mrs. Gorman finding out, but marrying him was out of the question. He got drunk often and didn't even want her as his wife at times. She felt like she was going mad until John came home. Mona looked up at John with a wistful, sad expression as she whispered the words. Belding watched Gorman and felt the fire rage within him while remaining cold on the outside. He believed he could predict the young man's future conduct. Gorman held Mona close, assuring her that the worst was over and that he wouldn't give up on her. Mona pleaded with John to promise he wouldn't hunt for him or go after him. She was afraid of what Mr. Radford Chase would do if he found out. Gorman begged John not to make matters worse, as the Chases were rich and powerful, but Belding couldn't be stopped. Mona was terrified that Mr. Chase would shoot him in the back, but John was confident that a man of his kind wouldn't even have the nerve to do that. As Mona begged John not to go, Gorman smiled, sending a chill down Belding's spine. She kissed him fiercely, with her eyes blazing black in her white face. Gorman left the patio, and Belding followed closely behind. They walked through the sitting room and found the Rangers, Mr. Gorman and Thorne, sitting outside on the porch. John went into his room without speaking. "Looks like something's about to happen," said Miller, sitting up with sharp eyes. Belding spoke a few words, wanting to make an impression on Mr. Gorman. However, he spoke with grim humor. "You better stop that boy. He'll cause some trouble. He's wilder than hell." "Stop him? Of course," replied Mr. Gorman, rising nervously. Just then John came out of his room wearing a hat and heavy gloves. Belding watched him closely but saw no changes other than his attire. "Richard, where are you going?" asked his father, concerned. "I'm going to see a man," replied John. "No, you will stay here. I forbid you to go," said Mr. Gorman, putting a hand on his son's shoulder. John gently moved Mr. Gorman aside and said, "Dad, I haven't stopped disobeying you. I'm sorry. Please don't interfere with me now and don't follow me. You might see something unpleasant." "But my son, what are you going to do?" asked Mr. Gorman, confused. "I'm going to beat a dog," replied John calmly. Mr. Gorman looked helplessly between his strange and cold son and the restless Belding. John strode off the porch, but Miller's voice stopped him in his tracks. "Hold on. John, you weren't going without me, were you?" "Yes, I was, but I'm thoughtless right now, laddie," replied John. "Sure you were. Wait a minute, John, I'm a sick man, but nobody can pull any stunts around here without me," said Miller as he hobbled along the porch and went into his room. Jim Lash knocked the ashes out of his pipe and, humming his dance tune, followed Miller. The Rangers suddenly emerged, both carrying guns. Belding felt a sense of satisfaction as he observed Mr. Gorman's reaction to their arrival. The old man turned pale and began shaking at the sight of the firearms. "You might want to stay back," Belding whispered. "John's going to take care of that two-legged animal, and the Rangers can get a little too trigger-happy." "I won't stay back," Mr. Gorman replied firmly. "I'll see this through. Belding, I know what's going on. Richard is going to fight the Chases, those crooks who have ruined you." "Well, I can't promise any fighting on their part," Belding retorted dryly, "but there might be some Mexicans with guns." Belding strode off to catch up with John, while Mr. Gorman followed behind with Thorne. "Where can we find the Chases?" John asked Belding. "They've got a place down the road next to the inn," Belding replied. "They call it their club. Radford will definitely be there at this time. I don't know about the old man, but his office is right across the street." As they passed several houses and turned a corner onto the main street, they came to a wide, low adobe building where a number of saddled horses were tethered to posts. Mexicans lounged around the entrance. "There's Ben Chase over on the corner," Belding pointed out to John. "See the tall man with the white hair and the leather band on his hat? He sees us. He knows something's going on. He's got men with him, and they'll be coming over. We're after the young guy, and he's sure to be in here." They entered the building, which was essentially a hall that would have been a saloon if it had a bar. There were 2 old pool tables, and it seemed that Chase had set up this area for his workers as well as his engineers and assistants, as there were both Mexicans and Americans present. A group of card players surrounded a large table near a window, smoking, drinking, and making a lot of noise. "Show me Radford Chase," demanded Gorman, scanning the room. "That big guy with the red face," replied his companion. "Ah, he's dropped his cards now, and he looks scared." John marched over while Belding whispered to Mr. Gorman, "Don't miss any of this. It's going to be good. Keep an eye on John and Laddie. If there's any shooting, hide behind me." Belding grinned with satisfaction as Mr. Gales went pale. John stopped at the table and with a swift kick sent it flying. Cards, chips, and glasses flew in all directions while chairs toppled over. "My name is Gorman, and I'm looking for Mr. Radford Chase," John bellowed. Radford himself stood up, shoulders back and chest out, and sneered at Gorman. "I'm Radford Chase," he announced boldly. The confrontation happened quickly. The tables and chairs lay scattered while one of the pool tables had been shoved aside. A lamp lay on the ground, oil spilled around it. Miller leaned against a post, holding a smoking gun. A Mexican sat huddled against the wall, crying over his broken arm. In the corner, another wounded Mexican moaned in pain. They had both tried to draw weapons on Gorman, and Miller had taken them out. In the center of the room lay Radford Chase, a pitiful, beaten figure, bloody and torn. He wasn't seriously hurt, but he was helpless, and he knew it. He sobbed and moaned and howled, but nobody moved to help him. Ben Chase stood by the door, stripped of all his authority, confidence, and courage. Gorman approached him, no longer the calm and collected man he had been upon entering the room. The man's face was drenched in sweat, his complexion as pale as a sheet of paper. His eyes blazed with an intense fire, seeming to flicker and dance in the dim light. His thin jaw hung open, trembling with fury. With a massive gloved hand, he shook his fist menacingly in Chase's direction. "Consider yourself lucky, old man. Your age is the only thing saving you right now. But don't cross me again, and make sure your son knows that every time I see him, I'll make him regret what he did today." Chapter 22. In the early morning, Gorman strolled in search of some peace and quiet where he could ruminate over his troubles. It wasn't easy for him to dodge the Yaqui, and when he finally found a secluded and shady spot to rest, the Indian appeared out of nowhere, silent and enigmatic as always. "Malo," he said in his low-pitched voice. "Yes, Yaqui, it's really bad," replied Gorman. The Indian had been informed of the misfortunes that had befallen Belding and his rangers. "Go me," said Yaqui with a grandiose gesture toward the towering lilac steps of No-Name Mountains. He seemed like his usual self, but Gorman's one quick glance made him aware of the old, peculiar power that Yaqui possessed. "Why does my brother want me to climb the nameless mountains with him?" asked Gorman. "Luviadoro," replied Yaqui, making some gestures that were not easy for Gorman to decipher. "Shower of gold," translated Gorman. That was the Yaqui's nickname for Mona. What did he mean by using it in relation to a trek up the mountains? Did his gestures suggest a shower of golden petals from the rare and stunning tree, or a deluge of golden rain? Gorman's lethargy vanished in a moment of contemplation. The Yaqui was talking about gold. Gold. He meant to say that he could recover the lost fortunes of the white brother who had saved his life on that dreadful day at Papago Well. Gorman felt a thrill surge through him as he gazed deeply into the magnificent eyes of the Indian. Would Yaqui never consider his debt paid? Gorman asked the Indian, hoping to finally settle their score. "Go me," Yaqui replied, pointing with his usual directness. "Yes, Yaqui," Gorman responded before rushing to his room to put on his hobnailed boots and grab a canteen. When he returned to the corral, Yaqui was waiting for him with a coiled lasso and a stout stick. Without a word, Yaqui led Gorman down the lane and towards the mountains. None of Belding's household saw them leave. As they journeyed, Gorman noticed that what had once been a narrow trail was now a well-trodden road. They passed a deep irrigation ditch full of flowing muddy water, and Gorman couldn't help but feel bitter about the work of the Chases. However, he was surprised to find that the engineers had anticipated his curiosity and had constructed ditches and a dam that created a magnificent reservoir. The sight of the reservoir filled Gorman with gladness, knowing that the people of Forlorn River would never experience an Oseko again. Yaqui led Gorman to the upper end of the reservoir where the stream roared down over unscalable walls. This was the farthest Gorman had ever been into the rough foothills, and he knew that no white man had ever climbed No-Name Mountains from the west. However, Gorman realized that a white man could never possess the range, valley, mountain, or desert like Yaqui and his people did. As they stood before the great gray ponderous wall of cliff, Gorman felt the old strange interest in the Yaqui seize him again. The bond between them was as strong as family ties. Gorman was curious to see how Yaqui would conquer the steep steps of stone. Yaqui left the gulch and made his way up a jumble of weathered slides, following the base of the towering wall. He scanned the wall and eventually selected a point to ascend. It was a spot where Gorman would have never thought climbing was possible. The wall rose before them, leaning over them and casting them in darkness. The surface was rough with countless cracks, crevices, and caves. Yaqui tied one end of his lasso to a stout stick and, after untangling the coils, whirled the stick round and round before throwing it over the first rim of the shelf about 30 feet up. The stick missed its target, but Yaki tried again, and this time the stick caught in a crack. He tugged on it and then, holding onto the lasso, began walking up the steep slope, hand over hand on the rope. When he reached the shelf, he signaled for Gorman to follow. Gorman found the method of scaling the wall to be both swift and effortless. Yaki pulled up the lasso and threw the stick aloft into another crevice, which led them to yet another shelf. On their third attempt, they reached a more rugged bench about 100 feet above the slides. Yaki worked to the left and went into a dark fissure, with Gorman hot on his trail. They emerged into a lighter area, but their view was still restricted by broken sections of the cliff. The ascent became arduous, and Gorman struggled to keep up with Yaki, even though he was stronger and more agile than most men. Scaling the desert heights was a matter of lung power for the Yaki. It was a slow, tedious, and dangerous process, but the Yaki's life had been spent doing just that. Gorman, on the other hand, was not used to this kind of physical exertion. As he climbed, he imagined he heard the dull roar of falling water several times. The sound seemed to come from all directions, and he couldn't pinpoint its source. He eventually forgot about it and focused on the climb itself. The climb was grueling, and Gorman burned his hands and knees. He grew hot, wet, and winded, and his heart thumped so hard it hurt. At times his vision blurred. Finally he reached the top where the Yaki was waiting for him. Gorman collapsed, exhausted, and took some time to rest while gazing at the blue sky. When he sat up, he was surprised to find that he was only 1,000 feet above the valley. It felt like he had climbed a mile. From his vantage point, he could see the village below with its new adobe structures, tents, and buildings. They stood in bright contrast to the older habitations. He could even make out Belding's white horses grazing in the green alfalfa fields. He imagined he could see Blanco Sol, too. However, his attention was drawn to the river. It was called Forlorn River, and he could see why. Even though it was full of water, it had a forlorn look to it. It wound its way down the valley, growing wider and shallower as it went. He knew it was doomed to fail on the desert and never make it to the Gulf. It disappeared on its sad journey toward Sonoita. The scorching sun beat down on the vast, shimmering desert, which only came to life during the flood season. The water was futile, and the dryness of the land was insatiable. Yaki placed a powerful, scarred hand on Gorman's knee, conveying his message with a simple touch. Gorman felt a sense of familiarity in the Indian's posture, with his bent head, dilating eyes, and rigid form. It reminded him of his lonely nights on the lava, which he had spent in terror. "What do you hear, Yaki?" Gorman inquired with a chuckle, trying to break the spell that had fallen over him. However, he found himself succumbing to Yaki's influence, and he too listened with bated breath. He heard nothing except for the piercing cry of an eagle. Gorman often wondered if the Indian could hear things that were silent to everyone else. Yaki was an enigma beyond comprehension. Whatever Yaki had been listening for, he had found it. He rose from his spot with a grunt that could have meant anything and turned away from the rim. Gorman followed, eager to move on after his brief moment of rest. He realized that the great cliff they had climbed was only a stepping stone to the looming plateau above. Suddenly he heard the sound of falling water, and it seemed to have cleared itself of the muffled vibrations that had previously muted it. Yaki climbed a small ridge and stopped abruptly. Gorman joined him and saw a bottomless gap into which a white stream was leaping. He followed the stream with his gaze until he saw a dark, round, boiling pool at the end of the narrow, swift stream. It was a bubbling well, a massive spring, and the outcropping of an underground river that flowed down from the plateau above. Yaki had brought him to the source of Forlorn River. Gorman's mind raced with thoughts of staking a claim here and never being cheated out of it. The excitement he felt was matched only by the thrills that ran over him. Water was brought down to the valley through ditches on the benches and troughs on steep walls. Ben Chase had constructed a magnificent dam that would be useless if Gorman decided to divert Forlorn River from its natural path. The source of the mysterious desert river belonged to Gorman, and his determination was stopped by Yaki's unexpected behavior. The Indian showed wonder, hesitation, and reluctance. His unusual eyes surveyed the boiling well with disbelief. Gorman realized that Yaki had never seen the source of Forlorn River before. If he had ever reached this plateau, it would probably have been to some other location since the water was new to him. He stood there gazing at the peaks, lower ramparts of the mountain, and nearer landmarks of prominence. Yaki seemed perplexed and uncertain of his location. Then he passed the swirling pool of dark water and started climbing a small slope that led to a shelving cliff. Another object halted the Indian. It was a pile of stones, weathered, crumbled, fallen into ruin, but still retaining enough shape to prove that it was built there by human hands. Yaki circled it repeatedly, and his curiosity attested to more confusion. It was as though he had stumbled upon something surprising. Gorman was intrigued by the pile of stones. Perhaps it had once been a prospector's claim. Grunted the Indian, and though his exclamation showed no satisfaction, it undoubtedly put an end to his doubt. He pointed to the roof of the sloping yellow shelf of stone. There, faintly outlined in red, were the imprints of many human hands with fingers spread wide. Gorman had seen such paintings on the walls of desert caves before. Evidently, these imprints told Yaki that he had reached his desired destination. Then his actions became swift, and Yaki seldom moved swiftly. This fact impressed Gorman. The Native American searched the flat ground below the shelf, gathering small black stones in his hand and presenting them to Gorman. The weight of the stones startled Gorman, causing him to tremble. The Native American then picked up a weathered rock and threw it against the wall, causing it to break. He then collected the broken pieces and showed them to Gorman, revealing yellow streaks, dull glints, and faint tracings of green. It was gold. Gorman's legs shook beneath him, causing him to sit down as he tried to gather all the pieces of stone onto his lap. As he dug through the black rocks with a knife blade, he found gold. He looked down the slope into the valley, but he couldn't see anything except the reality of his dream come true. Yaki had led him to a ledge of gold. Gorman, with his knowledge of minerals, realized that this was a rich discovery and was speechless with joy. However, he was also deep in thought about the Native American who had led him to this fortune. He recalled Belding, who had fallen into poverty, Mona, who had cried over the loss of a spring, Laddie, who was unable to ride, Jim Lash, who had always been a loyal friend, and Thorne and Selina. All these people had been kind to him, and he loved them dearly, yet they were all poor. However, with this discovery, they would all become his partners and be rich. Gorman had found the source of Forlorn River and was now rich in water, and Yaki had made him rich in gold. Gorman wanted to run down the slope into the valley to share his good news, but suddenly his eyes cleared, and he saw the pile of stones. His blood ran cold, then hot. A prospector's claim was marked by it, but it was ancient, and the wild slope had never been worked upon. Gorman couldn't find any other indications that a prospector had ever been there. He wondered where the one who had first staked this claim was. Gorman's hope grew as the fire eased and the cold passed. The Yaki let out a rare, low, and strange cry that somehow always seemed associated with death. Gorman shuddered in response. The Indian dug in the sand and dust under the shelving wall. He threw out a belt buckle that rang against the stone and old, shrunken, withered boots. The Yaki found other items before he stopped digging. The desert had claimed the prospector's grave. Gorman had seen more than one such grave, and Miller had told him many stories about them. It was a harsh reality. The sharp-eyed Yaki reached up to a small projecting shelf of rock and took a small object from it. He showed no interest in it and gave it to Gorman. When the flat oblong tin box was placed in Gorman's hands, he felt a strange sensation. Was it just the Yaki's presence, or was there an unseen force at work beside that grave? Gorman couldn't be certain, but he knew he was back in the old desert mood. He knew something important was about to happen. The moment couldn't be accounted for by accident, luck, or a debt-paying Indian. Gorman knew he held something worth more than gold in his hands. The box was still in decent condition, and when Gorman opened the lid, he smelled a faint, old, musty scent. He found a packet wrapped in what might have been oilskin. Gorman removed the covering and found a folded paper that was now yellow with age. Though the writing was faint, he could still make out the words. The note was barely legible, written hastily in blood, making it difficult to decipher. Holding it up to the light, he carefully studied the contents. Robert Edwards and Evans Simon offer 50% of the gold claim to whoever discovers it, and the remaining half to Mona Edwards, their daughter and granddaughter. Overwhelmed with emotion, Gorman's heart nearly exploded with joy at the realization of what he had found. He struggled to unfold the certificate, which was over 2 decades old, and it confirmed the marriage between Robert Edwards and Monet Simon. Chapter 23. On a summer day, the beautiful and still forlorn river was bathed in golden light with huge motionless clouds of white hovering over no-name peaks, and the purple hue of clear air in the distance along the desert horizon. Mrs. Belding returned that day to find her daughter happy and content, with the past buried forever in two lonely graves, which lifted the haunting shadow from her eyes. Gorman believed that he would never forget the sweetness, the wonder, and the passion of Mrs. Belding's embrace when she called him her boy and gave him her blessing. The little wrinkled padre who married Gorman and Mona performed the ceremony as he told his beads, without interest or penetration, and went his way, leaving happiness behind. "I was a sick man," Miller said, "and darn near a dead one, but I'm going to get well. Maybe I'll be able to ride again someday. Mona, I lay it to you. And I'm going to kiss you and wish you all the joy there is in this world. And John, as Yaki says, she's sure your shower of gold." He spoke of Gorman's finding love and talked about it with the deep and wistful feeling of the lonely ranger who had always yearned for love and had never known it. Belding, once more practical and important than ever before with mining projects and water claims to manage, spoke of Gorman's great good fortune in finding gold, which he called desert gold. Ah, yes. "Desert gold!" exclaimed John's father with a sense of pride in his eyes. He was happy that John had found a rich claim and won the heart of the girl he loved. However, John had a feeling that his father meant something more than just love and fortune when he mentioned desert gold. On that beautiful day, Yaki came to bid John farewell. John was surprised and saddened by Yaki's departure, but in his impulsive nature he forgot the Indian's true nature. Belding tried to shower Yaki with gifts, but the Indian only selected a few essential items like food, a blanket, a gun, a knife, and a canteen. The whole household accompanied Yaki to the corrals and fields, and Belding even allowed him to choose any horse, including the beloved Blanco Diablo. Gorman secretly hoped that the Indian wouldn't select Blanco Soul, but he would have given it away without any hesitation. Yaki whistled for the horses one last time, but he didn't show any affection towards them. He chose a lean and wiry bronco, put a blanket on its back, fastened the pack, and turned to his friends. He was the same inscrutable, emotionless Indian that he had always been. The parting meant nothing to him, as he had stayed to pay a debt and was now going home. He shook hands with the men, glanced over Mona, and rested his eyes on Selina's beautiful and agitated face. It must have been a moment of intense feeling for the Spanish girl. She owed him everything, her life, her happiness, and her love. She stretched out her delicate hands towards him, but Yaki didn't take them. Without a word, he mounted his bronco and headed towards the river. "He's going home," Belding said. "Home," Miller whispered. John knew that the ranger was lost in his memories of home, the desolate world of cacti and lava, the silent nights and the lonely days. "Thorn, Selina, Mona, let's climb that hill and watch him leave," John suggested. The others went back to the house while they climbed up the foothill. From the top, they could see Yaki riding up the far bank of the river. "Will he turn to wave goodbye?" Mona asked. "He's an Indian," Gorman replied. They watched as Yaki rode through the mesquites and up over the riverbank into the cactus. His silhouette was visible for a long time against the green and white background. The sun was setting, and Yaki was a wild, beautiful sight as he rode across a ridge. Then he disappeared. Gorman felt oddly relieved that Yaki had returned to his own people, the spirits of his ancestors, and the vast, desolate plains. He realized that he had known the spirit of the desert through Yaki, and that this spirit had awakened something wild and primitive in him. Selina's eyes glistened with tears, and Thorn kissed them away, reigniting the fire in her cheeks. Gorman turned to Mona and smiled. The vast desert stretched before him, both majestic and overwhelming, but he couldn't appreciate it in the same way as the Native Americans. As Mona's smile slowly returned, the dark, haunting presence that had gripped him dissipated entirely. He drew closer to her, whispering in her ear, "Lluvia d'oro," or shower of gold, and so their story continues. The end. This concludes Secret Mirage, a Western novel. Written by Ken Cannon. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.